I'm with the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. Justice in Action is our weekly conversation series with JCC social justice activists and residents, Ruth Messenger and New York City Council member Brad Lander. Each week, we meet to discuss a different social justice issue and the way that it's being impacted and exacerbated by COVID-19. This week, we're discussing the implications of COVID-19 on workers' rights and the complicated conversation of what it means to be an essential worker. Do you receive hazard pay, health insurance, sick leave? Can you afford not to work? And what does it all mean for non-essential workers who can't work? And how do we support them? And what is our obligation to do so? As a note, we're committed to hosting this conversation series, and the views and the opinions expressed by our panelists do not necessarily reflect the official policy and position of the co-host or the JCC. Today, we're joined by Tatiana Bejar, who is an organizer with Hand in Hand, a national employer of nannies, house cleaners, and home attendants. Rachel Kahan, a member of Hand in Hand's network as an employer of a nanny and a house cleaner. And Adam Obernauer, the director of the Retail Organizing Project of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Ruth, do you want to take it away?
Yes, I will. Actually, today we have three amazing guests with different perspectives, and we have Brad. And in this case, having Brad is even better than usually having Brad, because he's actually been focused in, just telling all of our listeners, on this issue of essential workers and on the broader issue of workers' rights and on the particular issue of all those people that are in fact particularly affected by this serious change in lives and downturn in the economy that by and large people don't always think about. So I want to say to the people who are listening, you'll be able to think more about this as the next hour unfolds. But I want you to think about the people on whom, two big questions. The first question is, who are the people on whom you are currently depending to do good work for you or for your family? And I want to say, with huge respect for the medical profession in this city, and with huge love for the way the communities come out at 7 p.m. and bang the pots and pans, those are not the only workers on whom I depend. I depend on so many people who are doing work, who are mandated to go to work, even if it's dangerous for them because they're essential, who are trying to go to work because it's the only possible way in which they can get paid. But, anything that I'm doing in this pandemic, literally, I just want to say this clearly because I want other people to think about this, anything I'm doing other than literally sitting on my couch and reading a book is dependent on some bunch of people who are going to work.
Really, even the couch and the book could probably, come from work. So.
Right, and where I get the book is precisely right, and so I just need people to sort of be open to thinking by the end of this program, not about the substantive policy issues that we're going to discuss with Adam and Tatiana and Rachel, but about the ways in which each of us is ourselves implicated in keeping workers going or protecting them because they are essential to us and essential to the society. So I sort of like for that framework, and also, and I know that Rachel will talk about this, but for everybody who in any way depends on someone else's labor for some part of their lives, you are then an employer, and the question of how you treat your employees, how you work with those people who are fighting for basic rights for those people who are your employees is a way of broadening your mind frame. With all of that, I'm about to turn it over to Brad, who's done quite a bit of work on this, is probably in intimate terms with lots and lots of gig workers and whatever, but we all have to ask Brad first about his last hour, because he was handling a speak out webinar, whatever, with Elizabeth Warren talking about these issues. So Brad, you get the first 5 minutes to tell us about your last hour, and then I'm going to ask you to interact with our guests, and I'll be a occasional commenter.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really nice to see you. And Rachel, Tatiana, and Adam, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll just build off one way I try to build actually what Ruth said into my regular routine. And it comes from my rabbi, now I guess my retired rabbi, but still my dear Rabbi Ellen Lippman, who, offered a blessing when we do motzi, when we say the prayer over the bread, to like just pause before you say it. And sometimes if you're holding hands with your family, it's good because you're making a sort of chain, and just imagine the chain of work that brought that bread to your table. And like this is good if you're like religious too, and you like start with God, because it takes sunshine and some miracles of biology and chemistry to like grow the stuff in the ground. But you got workers in the field, you've got workers at the chain all along the way in industrial bakeries and mills. You've got truck drivers driving it. You've got a grocery store full of people that are stocking the shelves, even when there's not COVID. And it's just like a useful, like every week at least on Shabbos when we say motzi, it's like one way of remembering how much labor our lives depend on. And then you go this one step deeper and think about how badly we do at honoring that work, because a lot of the workers along that chain like don't have enough, pay not to worry about losing their house and getting evicted. They don't have good durable health care, don't have, for the most part, enough savings in their bank account to think about retirement security or the kids' education. And I just think in this time of crisis that has really been amplified, like the fact that the set of people we call essential workers in so many cases just lack like the very basics of pay and workplace protection and dignity. So the Instacart or DoorDash delivery person that's bringing the meals you're ordering every night, they can't take a paid day off if they're sick, because we let Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart create a model of economics that has workers. And yet they were just like, well, we'd rather not pay the workers healthcare and retirement security and sick leave. And so we're going to call them independent contractors. And we kind of all let that happen. And so now that we call those guys essential workers, but like not only don't they have retirement security or healthcare, they can't even take a paid sick day. So, and then you see doctors and nurses and Amazon workers who don't have enough personal protective equipment, but if they have the guts to speak out, they might get fired because they're at-will employees and they can be fired with no notice and no reason at all. And like, that doesn't sound like we think it's essential if we don't give you the basic protection that you could only be fired for a good reason and you'd have whistleblower protections. And one last irony here, I'm really glad that we've stood up a good, strong unemployment insurance program. It's going too slow and it's hard to get your money, but money was at least added in so that it pays a decent amount once you start getting it. But it pays on average about $22.50 an hour, the equivalent if you were working. But what that means is there are many essential workers out there going to work every day and earning less money than they would be if they were on unemployment insurance. And a few employers, because like RWDSU has organized to win hazard pay, some folks are paying bonuses for this time, but a lot of people just got like a one-time $100 or $200 bonus, not anywhere near enough to compensate. So just like, thinking about that when you're banging those pots and pans at 7, and like what it would look like to build an economy that really recognized that all work has dignity and value. And if we call it essential, we got to treat it as
I'm on the
essential.
program.
So we are fighting. The reason we had Elizabeth Warren on this call is that she's introduced a package of legislation in Washington, and we've introduced a kind of, scaled down for New York City model called the Essential Worker Bill of Rights. I don't want to go into it now because I really want to get in dialogue with our guests, but it would give paid sick leave to that DoorDash or Instacart driver. It would give protections from unfair firing to some of those essential workers. We'd like to find a way to do hazard pay. That probably needs to be federal legislation rather than local, because it's a pretty complicated and broad and expensive. And at the federal level, there's also some other pieces to it. So it was really powerful. We had 5 essential workers on from a number of unions, including an RW member, actually, whose story was in the New Yorker. She had a great article, and I'll drop it in the chat because she's quite an impressive character. But I guess what I'll just end by saying is that, the legislation doesn't happen, because we want it to, or because we cheer for it, or because it's right. It happens because people organize to build power for it through more traditional unions like RWDSU, and then through innovative organizing like the National Domestic Workers Alliance has done, and now built such a great partnership with Hand in Hand between domestic employers and domestic workers. So I feel really thrilled that what we get to do now for the rest of this hour is hear from you guys. Talk about the work you were doing before the pandemic, because if you hadn't been doing that organizing and building power, it wouldn't have been there to try to show up now. And about, you know, what in your sectors we can learn from and organize for to do better in this crisis. So yeah, why don't you just first give us a little background, because I think these are not necessarily organizations that our folks know about. So talk a little about, you know, what the organization was before the crisis, and then how the crisis has, you know, has changed what you're up to.
Somebody goes first.
Tatiana, you want to introduce us to Hand in Hand?
Sure, I'll go first. So this is great. Thank you so much for inviting us. So yeah, Hand in Hand, we are the Domestic Employers Network. We are a national network of employers of nannies, house cleaners, and home attendants. And we believe that by having good working conditions benefits everyone at home, basically benefits the employer and the worker, right? And we believe that we are really have this strong and deep interdependence, no, and we need each other. And as we are realizing with this crisis, no, domestic workers are an important part of our lives, right? So the mission of Hand in Hand is to support domestic employers become, like we call, fair care employers, good employers, no, and also fight alongside with domestic workers organizations, not to transform this industry, the care industry, to become an industry that is fair and also accessible to all. And maybe, should I just stop here and maybe let others introduce?
Yeah,
Do this.
let's go. Yeah, let's do it bit by bit. So Rachel, why don't you pick up, since you're connected to Hand in Hand, and then we'll go to Adam.
Thank you. I'm an employer partner with Hand in Hand. I believe strongly in the fair care principles behind Hand in Hand, and really my job is to honor the domestic workers by fighting for things large and small, whether it's sick pay legislation, helping to protect domestic workers who are immigrants in this political moment. And also, you know, as we've moved into this crisis, making sure that they are still paid during this crisis if their employers are able, and that they have access to things like healthcare and emergency funds. And I actually joined, I'm a Brad Lander constituent, I joined a neighbor who sort of pulled me into working with Hand in Hand in Carroll Gardens, and we built a hub there that has been a model for other parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan to help support domestic workers in those neighborhoods.
Great. Adam.
Hey everyone, so my name is Adam Obernauer. I work at the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, the RWDSU. It's a wonderful acronym. We clearly too long and complicated, but where to start? You know, we're a union. We in New York City, we have a lot of retail workers, both food retail and grocery and non-food. And around the country, we have a lot of food production workers. So a lot of the stories you may have seen around poultry workers and meat packing workers fighting for their rights, a lot of them are non-union, and a lot of them are our members who, and we've been fighting with employers on that as well around the country. We protect workers' rights. We organize workers into unions, and then we also do issue-based campaigns with workers that are non-union that want to improve their workplace through the Retail Action Project. I'll leave it at that, and then I guess we'll open the panel in a little bit.
Good. And yes, and people can put questions in the chat room or you know, and Tess will relay those questions to us. I think we're interested in what's going on now in each of your lives. The pandemic, you know, the pandemic has thrown a lot of things up in the air. Everyone is doing differently. A lot of people have, by choice or by necessity, kind of changed the focus of their work. And then I think that organizations and organizers such as yourselves are also thinking about what does it mean when this is, quote, over, and what happens when it's over that might change some of these dynamics and create greater equity for more workers. Tatiana?
Yeah, maybe I should start just by providing a little bit of context, right? Of what means domestic work or the history of domestic work in the United
Good.
States. Now, we're talking about a workforce has been historically excluded from basically all labor protections, right? Excluded from the Fair Labor Standard Acts, didn't have the right of minimum wage, overtime, to get unionized. It's a workforce that mostly has the legacy of slavery, but women of color doing domestic work, which was unpaid, right? And continues being not currently working in very precarious conditions, right? So that's how they're coming when we talk about domestic workers, and a sector that has no safety net really, and has just recently, just some years ago, that we have our first victory, let's say, in 2010 when in New York, domestic workers started organizing, and won the first domestic workers Bill of Rights in the United States, which is incredible. That was the first time in the country has a historic Bill of Rights. And this is how Hand in Hand started, actually, with a group of employers from Brooklyn, and I think Brad was part of them, maybe, or supported.
I was not an elected official yet. Then I was like a member, we went out to Albany and lobbied together. And
exactly, yes. And this is what it means, right? Organizing with domestic employers is really understanding the nature of the work and being in solidarity, not being in aligning with the fights of domestic workers to win, right? These important legislations. So we understand that we are talking about like intersection of labor justice, gender justice, racial justice, when we talk about this sector and how they have been living in crisis. This is not really, this is like an emergency moment, but we are talking about workers who have been really living in crisis for too long, right? But however, we have just, we were saying, some victories, and after this, after New York, California, Connecticut, like around 6 states, all have already a domestic workers Bill of Rights, a few cities like Seattle and Philadelphia. So the movement is growing, right? And as the movement of domestic workers is growing, the same happens with domestic employers, right? We organize in a way in which we don't antagonize employers, that when we do workplace justice is different. We want employers to be part of the movement, right? This is we talk about domestic work is such an intimate relationship, right? Happens at the private home. So each employer needs to understand that although we feel that domestic workers are part of our families, this is really a labor relationship. And your home is a workplace in which you, before feeling any emotional connection with your worker, you need to make sure you're an employer in which you need to set standards of respect, dignity, and recognize the human rights and the humanity, of course, of your worker, right? So, and that happens in a way that is a transformation of a human being too, right? As employer, and then probably Rachel can talk more about that, is not acknowledging the power dynamics at home, acknowledging your privilege, right? Mm-hmm. And then instead of doing that, really connecting your experience, it could be as a mom, as also a working mom, and as a woman with the person you employ. So we realized that after passing all these great legislations is not enough, because even with the Bill of Rights is so basic. Like, for example, provides only 3 days of paid rest for domestic workers, right? That's definitely not enough, right? That's not really living wage when we talk about paying your domestic workers. So it's hand in hand comes with a set of resources like the Fair Care Pledge and other resources to support employers to be fair care employers, and not recommendations about paying living wage, paying reliable on time. I mean, this is a big issue for low wage workers, right? Restaurant workers that they pay hourly, sometimes don't pay on time. Paying obviously overtime. That is a big issue, wage theft in this industry. And the other is have an open and trustworthy, let's say, communication with the person you employ at home. When you hear from workers, for example, one of the things that I always say, I wish my labor is acknowledged. Just to have a few minutes talking with a person, who is my employer, having a check-in, saying, hey, how are you doing? what is
Right.
working, what is not working. No, that's very important, right? So we provide all these different set of recommendations with workshops, webinars, like as Rachel was saying, creating these hand-in-hand hubs in different neighborhoods in which we strategize together with domestic workers organizations. We are a sister organization of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, for example, and work closely with their affiliates like Carroll Gardens Association, no, in Brooklyn, for example. And so this is like, let's say, in quote unquote normal circumstances, right? We have then, after the presidential elections in 2016, and we have this new political moment in which immigrant communities were targeted, people of color were targeted. Definitely this is close to what we work, right? It's very close to what is going on at home. So what your workplace, your home for an employer is also a center of moral and political action. So we also mobilize employers to fight family separation. We have this tactic called playdate protest, in which families, children, grandparents, neighbors, everyone came in the neighborhood to support immigrant neighbors, to support immigrant communities, right? Calling for closing the camps and telling what is going on, really, right? And being in solidarity again, no, and with workers who are really contributing to our economy, no, and has been invisible for so long. So after, well, maybe I end there, so we can let others speak, but then I guess Brad and Ruth, we will be talking about how we have adapted our work under COVID-19. No?
Thank you. Adam, over to you.
And Adam, one thing I think that would be helpful is like talk about the difference about being, you know, if you being in a retail food worker in a unionized shop from being one who's not in a unionized shop, and like what difference it makes. Because obviously we try to win laws, but you guys organize people and then win workplace protections, and just, you know, talk a little about what that means and what your members have that folks who are out there in our, you know, bodegas or a non-union grocery store don't.
Sure. So yeah, a little bit about the union and what it means for folks, just because I want to, you know, not assume anything. So, you know, when you have a union contract, and you have a legal binding contract that the employer needs to follow. In moments of like this, like the pandemic, any change of the work relationship that happens, whether it's through a natural disaster or through something like the COVID-19 pandemic, it opens the bargaining for the union to have conversations with the employer, with the members of the union and the employers, to bargain over the terms of any workplace changes that will happen. So that's a very big difference for non-union employers who, if you've probably seen much of it, workers are just furloughed, they're laid off. There's not a lot of communication in retail that are not food retail, that are not open right now. Workers are laid off and they have no idea if they're going to be rehired in many cases. In some cases, they've heard that they're going to be rehired, but it's not binding legally or anything. So the employer has full control of everything that they do and every decision they make, whether they give severance to workers, whether they don't give severance, whether they continue paying healthcare. As it stands right now, all of our members are still insured. We're working with our healthcare plan and our employers to figure out how to keep workers insured, so all of our members are insured up through June. We have, which is a big deal, right? You know, you're out of work, you're furloughed currently. You have someone at the union that you can talk to about where negotiations are at over the terms of healthcare or anything as it relates to sick leave or severance rights. So that's the major difference in any type of instance like a pandemic, like we're dealing with, is that you have a seat at the table in a very real way. So when we talk about hazard pay, you know, we fought for hazard pay for all of our workers in different locations like ShopRite, Stop and Shop, the grocery and food production. I know that Brad, you had mentioned the bonuses. You know, Tyson, a lot of these large employers were throwing a one-time $200 bonus at workers. That doesn't cut it. So we fought for bonuses to be reoccurring, you know, every 2 weeks, every month, depending on what we can get from employers. But, you know, I think that the overall summary is that no employer is just going to do that. especially in a moment like this, unless there's an organized workforce that is able to push back. So I would say that, and a little bit more about what we're doing now. As you can imagine, for non-union workers, we have probably been getting more calls now than we have in years on what do I do? You know, how do I make things better at work? I think my employer is violating the law. What are all these new laws? There's these state laws that are out there. There's a federal law around COVID-19 that I don't understand. So what we've been doing is we've been walking workers through, helping them navigate the new system, but also, can you organize around that? You know, what are your coworkers feeling? Is there something that your coworkers and you can come together with to demand from your employer that they do better? And just so folks that are on the call know too, you know, there is the institutional union, like our union, right? And then there are workers that come together to demand things from their employer, and that's still considered concerted activity. So it's legally protected activity. So we are walking a lot of workers through how they can address things in the short term, because there's immediate needs. And the unionization process is a longer process. It's the best process to go through to be protected long term, so that you have a document that employers have to follow. But we don't stop there. You know, we say in a moment like this, get together, take collective action. We will train you to do so. And long term, the union is the way to have this type of collective action enforced for the long term at your workforce. But if we can't unionize right now, we can certainly try to make things better. A quick example of workers coming together to demand better is at Trader Joe's. We received a lot of calls from Trader Joe's workers during this. And the purpose for Trader Joe's was, you know, we don't have PPE. And a lot of these other supermarkets do. And, you know, they had to fight for that PPE. They had to put together a petition. They did some deliveries at specific work sites in New York and demanded that they get access to masks. And they did win that, right? So it shows you that worker action and collective action can get better results when you come together with your coworkers to demand certain things. So that's kind of what the crux of our work has become. It's certainly become a lot of reactionary, you know, stuff of how do we fix this now? And then I think it's going to be a very interesting world when things reopen, because there's going to be potentially workers that don't feel comfortable going back to work and being put into the front lines of this, depending if they're immune compromised or just don't feel safe because of their age or anything. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of that. And, you know, it opens the moment for a lot of economic instability that we are going to fight for organizing during the time. So I'll end there. And then, yeah.
That was great, Adam. Thank you. Yeah, and I think a really good lens in. I think some folks on this call, I'm sure, you know well kind of how a union works and what organizing looks like and why it matters. But I bet, you know, it's a kind of thing we take for granted and don't, you know. I actually saw something interesting. There's a couple of great labor reporters, Sarah Jaffe and Stephen Greenhouse, who are like, but, you know, usually like they're the only ones who ever write a labor story. And at this point, it seems like almost every story is a labor story. But I think we sometimes still kind of take for granted. We set up such a cockamamie set of workplace protections, and we're grateful to everybody who's organizing. All right, so Tatiana, you were going to pick back up and talk a little about, how you guys have shifted now, and you talked a little about trying to make sure people get paid, but I know it's got to be a very scary time. I know you have a lot of members who are undocumented and therefore can't get any of the federal relief. So talk a little more about
Sure.
how you guys have adapted and what you're doing.
So to get a sense also of the number of workers we are talking about, in the United States, there are, I believe, 2.2 million domestic workers, which means there are more domestic employers, right? Because some nannies work for 2 employers, or some house cleaners or home care workers have multiple employers. In New York City, I believe it's a little bit more than 200,000. Workers, domestic workers. So it's an important a sector when we really talk about the time of the exclusion and the precarious conditions they face. So as I was saying, the fair care pledge for us, this is the foundation of our work, our principles, paying a living wage, clear expectations, and paying time off, which means paying more than basic leave, which, as I was saying, only 3 days of rest in New York State and only 2 days of basic leave in New York City. So we recommend more than 5 days for employers of domestic workers, and also at least 2 weeks of paid vacation, which we don't have a legislation that provides paid vacation for most of low-wage workers, right? So when this crisis happens, we act like many of these the workers organizations, like a rapid responders, right? We're getting calls, emails, our members reaching out to us that what we are gonna do. I mean, that was like the beginning of the crisis. There is so much anxiety, so much fear from workers and employers that we realized we really needed to be really quick, in providing recommendations on how to be a fair care employer during COVID-19, right? So it came from paid taxi, very in the beginning, right? Paid taxi, maybe change work hours or maybe reduce the work hours, but continue paying the regular wages, right? So avoiding the economic impact on the worker, and also consider in that moment, maybe it was better for the workers to stay home and be safe, right? So when Governor Cuomo issued the mandate on essential businesses, NDWA and Hand in Hand released a memo in which we were recommending, or we consider, that nannies and house cleaners were not considered essential workers in that sense, right? So they're essential in our lives, as we are realizing, and Rachel could say that how much she misses Annie at home. But in that moment, we couldn't put workers who don't have access to healthcare, do not have access to so many labor protections, in risk. So we have released like a campaign called The Pledge, in which we were asking employers not to sign this pledge to commit and continue paying their workers while their workers stay home and they are safe. And we have been doing that. Now we just recently have a social media campaign, and ends actually tomorrow, and in which we are inviting people to sign this pledge. So as we're saying, yeah, we said it also released just recently another set of or another toolkit on benefits that are based on the federal and state benefits for COVID-19 for workers. There is, again, a lot of confusion, and we need to come up with, when we talk about employers, and there's that huge difference between the employers you are dealing, for example, Adam, right? This is just people who employ someone at home and might not even consider themselves employers, right? They think, okay, I mean, I think I'm doing well. I think I'm being a good employer, right? But that's not reality always. So it's really supporting people who do not have a human resources department, right? It has like someone who is going to let them know about the law. So it's a lot of outreach. It's how we can reach out to all these hundreds of thousands of employers, to make sure that they are following our recommendations, and really in this moment, trying to navigate this crisis as impacting us all, right? But in a way that they are not putting their workers, their employees, in danger, and also realizing that while most employers have their safety net, domestic employers are the safety net of domestic workers, right? So understanding that is really important. And maybe Rachel, you want to say?
Yeah, Rachel, talk a little, I mean, not only about like what it means to step up as part of that campaign, but like what it means to step up as part of that campaign, while also, I assume, like trying to work and providing the child care 24/7 yourself, and all that means.
Well, we definitely say at Hand in Hand that domestic workers' work is what makes all other work possible, and this crisis really drives that point home. As you can see, my 2-year-old just woke up from her nap, and I am lucky enough to still be employed. We're actually, the company I work for is actually surviving quite well during this crisis. And so I'm still being paid, and as long as I'm being paid, the people who work in my home are going to be paid. And that, to that end, I've taken the pledge that Hand in Hand has, that requests that domestic workers, as a matter of moral and social justice, continue to pay their workers during this time if they're able to do that. So yes, I fairly early on, when it became clear that my office was going to close, I started talking with my nanny about what that meant. And it was clear that, like many nannies, she doesn't live in my neighborhood and does need to use public transportation to, I don't know if you could hear the marbles in the background.
Don't worry, don't worry.
Here, I'm going to move location for a second. We had a little bit of time during nap time, but those days are over. So we, anyway, so we wound up moving our family out of the city temporarily so that we could help care for elderly relatives. And initially, I stayed home for a little while. Our nanny was able to come to our home because we agreed to drive her. And that was, I would not ask someone to take the subway right now. And then when it became clear that all non-essential workers were being told to stay home, and that included me and her, then we all had to figure out what we were going to do. And as Tatiana was saying, it was that point when we really started to hear from other nannies and workers about how they were basically being furloughed, sometimes kindly, sometimes very unkindly, by their employers, who simply didn't want to have other people in their home. One was told that, the other residents of the building didn't want nannies coming in, so they had to work that out. But in most cases, it was simply a question of, well, if you're not coming into my home to do the work, then why am I paying you? Which is a complete sort of moral betrayal of everything that a relationship like that is supposed to entail. This person comes into your home to work and to care for your family. And so, as Tatiana said, it's a very intimate kind of relationship that I think one of the things that I've learned in my experience as an employer is it doesn't come naturally because so many of us white collar employees are used to a much more corporate hierarchical kind of relationship. And so then suddenly to have someone in your home is a whole different set of responsibilities. But I really feel that it is our responsibility to care for our workers who care for our children. And of course, this crisis is not going to go on forever. So we're also going to need those people to come back to work when it's over. And if their families are financially destroyed because they're not being paid, then what kind of relationship are you really going to have? There's been this moral betrayal. With our house cleaners, we actually simply have continued to pay them by Venmo and just ask them not to come. I think house cleaners are a really vulnerable population in general because often they do work where they're not even, they don't even see their employers. Often the employers are at the office, they kind of come in and do their work and leave. And so in that case, maybe there's not the same level of emotional connection that you would have with a nanny. And so those workers also have really suffered. And one of the things that I've been doing recently is trying to connect nannies and house cleaners in my network who I know are out of work with the National Domestic Workers Alliance Coronavirus Care Fund, which my family donated to early on and which has actually received a lot of good grant money. And they have quite a good war chest. But for example, recently there was a nanny in our neighborhood who her husband developed COVID-19. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He was very, very sick. He was on a ventilator, and fortunately he did survive, but the family had no income at all. They were really in desperate straits, and we were able to access that fund to help care for them, and then also to find other sources of support. And so a lot of this is coming down to hand-in-hand functioning more than ever as a mutual aid organization, that it's not a charity. It's not a true labor union, although I wish we could collectively bargain the way a true union does, but it is mutual aid, and it requires employers like me to step up and say, if I'm being paid, then I will help make sure that you and your family are taken care of and that you're paid. And in the case of many of my neighbors who have suddenly just seen their income vanish,
Yeah, right.
their responsibility then, as we see it, is to help their nannies in whatever way possible, whether it's helping them file for unemployment, it's helping them get emergency funds, and fortunately many people seem to be doing that.
Yeah, and just quickly to add that according to the National Domestic Workers Alliance, around 70% of domestic workers has lost their jobs or incomes, during this crisis. So it's a high number, of workers, and as we know, many of them are undocumented, so they don't have access really to unemployment.
And so,
Yeah, I just had a question for Rachel. This is great, and we'll get back to Adam in a minute. But Rachel, in the circles in which you move, not people who've actually joined Hand in Hand and its advocacy agenda so thoroughly, but just in general, I'm wondering what you run into when you say to people, essentially, of course I'm paying my nanny.
It's the people who are not people of goodwill, shall we say, and who are doing the wrong thing. I think many of them are sort of doing that quietly because they know it's not socially acceptable to do that kind of harm. But generally, I do think, when I look at all the work that I've done with Hand in Hand, I would say about 80% of people want to do the right thing. And so they're very open to direction about what are in normal times, what are the best practices, what's the right sort of contract to have with your nanny. In crisis times like this, they're really looking for practical solutions. And also what I keep seeing constantly is people asking for help in accessing things like unemployment payments, tax credits for employers. It's really, the system is quite Byzantine right now in terms of, how you qualify, what you can get, how employers can help. And so the majority of questions I'm getting are related to that. If I can't pay my nanny, if I have to lay her off, how can I help her? The rest of the time, to your question, Ruth, it's simply, all I can do is say, I'm doing the thing that I think is the right thing to do. I think you should do that too. And I do think there's a certain amount of peer pressure among predominantly white, college-educated, privileged Brooklynites. There's a certain amount of pressure to try and do the right thing.
Ruth,
that's great. I think that's great because a piece of my experience is that, maybe the community you're in is a little different, but a lot of people don't understand that argument. And so they need the information and the rationale and some of the peer pressure in order to step up. So Adam, tell us. Good.
I think they generally, I think that the ones who are convincible are very easily convinced. The ones who are not convincible were probably not on board with workers' rights to begin with.
And Rachel, I'll jump in here and say one thing that because I know from a lot of conversations with Hand in Hand and domestic worker organizing, like there is a kind of an interesting, I don't want to say tension, but there's something beautiful in the mutual aid organizing model, and like the fact that there's a real relationship that you have and that you try to like work through what's the like emotional relationship and what rights people deserve and how to honor them and build something from that. But what you're saying and like the facts that Tatiana mentioned also just reveal like how much, unfortunately we probably can't really rely on that as the way to bring broad justice, like got to be a set of laws in place that guarantee everyone workplace protections and unemployment insurance. And there's something beautiful in relationships that really respect, but if people are going to actually have the rights they got to have, we're going to have to win them in ways that don't rely on the generosity of people like the Hand in Hand.
It is the problem, and it's where I listen really enviously to what Adam's saying about the power of collective bargaining and unions, because the real flaw in domestic work is that it is a really unregulated market and it's very one-on-one. It's one person and one employer. There's not the kind of structure that you need to organize, which is why National Domestic Workers Alliance has been they have served the purpose of providing aid to workers and kind of banding together. And it's where, this is to me also where employers need to come in. So when I go to a city council meeting to talk about social justice and rights for domestic workers, or I go to Albany to lobby for those things, it's important to see, it's important for workers, and it's very important for the political structure to see that these are things that employers want. So it's not just the workers asking for their rights or advocating for themselves, but to see that employers also can lobby for those. And you don't necessarily see the same kind of thing in a traditional labor union, but it's what we have to do.
No, I think that's important because, again, I think people often don't know what to do, don't know what's the best way to make this a formal relationship. Adam, talk about what's going on under the times and impact of the virus, but talk particularly also about this category of people you're now working with, I assume is growing in this economy. I don't mean in the pandemic economy, but I mean in the economy in general.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, one thing, so before the whole pandemic, workers, obviously the economy is what it is and workers want to unionize. One thing that we see now, there are a lot of employers taking advantage of the pandemic, which is sad. Laying off a lot of workers. There's a lot of violations on health and safety that we're seeing. There are employers that are telling workers to go, work without a mask or meet with, there's a lot of that going on under the table. Unfortunately, I feel that in any situation, most larger employers try to take advantage however they can because they're just trying to make the bottom line, right? So, what we see is a wild contradiction, I think, too, that I think is worth saying. In a lot of food processing and manufacturing and grocery and all of low-wage jobs, you have a lot of undocumented immigrants. Our union represents a lot of undocumented immigrants. And I think what's really interesting to watch is all essential workers. A large majority of them are undocumented. And when you look at that, and the terms of what makes a person legal or not, it's an interesting contradiction of someone, being considered
Essential, yeah.
Or not legal, but they are essential for the economy to function. And I think so, that's just a side note of something that I think this pandemic is kind of uplifting workers that are doing minimum wage work, but it's minimum wage work that we need to survive as a society. And, I think especially it's opened a lot of people's eyes to grocery workers in general and food workers. And, when you want to go to a restaurant, right, or you want to go anywhere, and that's obviously out of the purview of our WDSU, but we see it in food. And I think that is something that people may have a different appreciation towards, but there's no reason that every grocery store that isn't union is making minimum wage, that all the workers are making minimum wage and the working conditions aren't great. I think we have to shift our value system here to appreciate, like Brad mentioned at the beginning of the meeting or of the forum, is, look at your plate every time you eat and think about, how did these things get here? And, how essential are the people that are doing that work? So for us, we are, and I have to at least mention the horrible president that we have, just because of how horrible it's been for the labor rights in this country. And, what we're looking at now, we had 3 union elections that were planned before the pandemic that are canceled indefinitely and still delayed. And we have hundreds and hundreds of workers waiting to vote for their union. But Trump is not giving any direction for DC, which is allowing for different regions of the labor board to make their own decisions. And a lot of those decisions are inaction. So there's a lot of workers that are not able to actually organize formally right now, which opens up what I mentioned earlier, is just taking power, organizing collectively, taking that power and moving forward as if that's the only thing that we have at this moment. Because if we wait for DC and we wait for Trump to give any guidelines to the National Labor Board, we're waiting, and just workers are the folks that are losing in these scenarios and these situations. So I have to mention that because it's really bad, what the lack of interest even in protecting workers' rights from the top down in the country right now. So yeah, and you know what that's meant for us is a lot of transitioning and relationship building through Zoom, through digital
Oh,
means,
God.
and we've formed many committees at many workplaces that, and some of which have taken action, and we haven't physically met yet. So it's definitely a different position to be in. But I think we're in a really, and it's unfortunate to say because of why we're here, but we're in an interesting moment with the economic situation we're in. And then the amount of collective power that workers are more willing to try to take at this moment because of the horrible conditions that they're facing. So I think we're going to see a significant upswing in workers that are willing to take more risks. And when the labor board doesn't respond or doesn't listen to your rights or advocate for them, then you're going to do what you have to do. And I think that's kind of where we're seeing wildcat strikes. We're seeing entire shifts of workplaces walk off, and employers don't have a great grip on that. So anyway, I mean, I'll end with that, and I guess see if there are questions and stuff.
I think in the last few minutes, one thing we want to do is kind of give people some sense of what they can do here.
Right.
You know, if this set of issues are issues that they care about. So yeah, and it's probably a little more straightforward, or at least, you know, like domestic, you know, hand in hand. I think, you know, you could join, but although if you're not you might not be if you're not a domestic employer. So yeah, if you could each talk a little about, you know, assuming people are inspired by what you offered here, which I know they are. What are things you'd like to see people do?
Maybe I'll start, yes, but just mentioning that we won't be able to transform the domestic work sector and just in general low wage workers, no, and unless we really hold the government accountable. That was Adam was saying, you know, at the federal level, but also the state and city level. Like, for example, domestic workers, we just passed at the state level the basic leave, which is fantastic, but domestic workers were excluded. So they have the right to get sick, but not to get paid. Right, so we need to really be consistent, and is how we, you know, move legislation, and we assume we are doing, you know, progressive, you know, work as elected officials. I really applaud Brad Lander, no, because he has always been a strong supporter of domestic work. We would love to also talk to our council members, have his leadership, and how we can also, you know, cover, if it's possible, domestic workers in the essential workers bill, for example. Yeah.
I want to say one thing here, just because we're talking to people on the West Side, and it's thanks to Ruth's successor in the city council, Gail Brewer.
Yeah,
Domestic workers are covered in the New York City law.
Yes.
And it's funny because my way of winning things is usually by like shouting and organizing and going out in the streets with the workers. Gail snuck that in, basically. Like, Brad, don't do your thing. Don't get out there. Just be quiet. No one even knows we put domestic workers in the New York City paid sick leave law. And let's just keep it that way. And she was right, and it passed. And so it's not in the state bill, but it was in the city bill. And I want to
no. That was that was another historic bill, right? Like a legislation. That's what I think Adam and I actually met when I was organizing restaurant workers, right? And I was like, my God, it was like unbelievable. So much is like incredible that we were trying to pass something so basic. Right, but yes, I mean, I think it would be great to see how the city government can support domestic workers under this crisis, you know, and also domestic employers who want to do the right thing. We know that there is a lot of, you know, mobilization and see how we can save small businesses in our communities, but how we can also support domestic employers who have been, you know, hit by the crisis and are still doing the right thing, how we can bring all these different issues together. So we would love to have another conversation and see how domestic work can be part of the essential workers bill, if there is any way we could, you know, participate. But yes, I'm saying it's really really transforming, you know, this sector, and cultural norms is a responsibility of government, you know, workers and employers, you know. And I will maybe just end as just obviously honoring, you know, all the workers who are part of our lives, even if we don't see them, even if we don't talk to them. Now, the teachers who teach my kids in Zoom classes, right, that are always ready in the morning. and the grocery store workers that I'm always get so worried about them because they don't live in the neighborhood, right? They have to take public transportation, and for sometimes over an hour to go to work for a minimum wage, right? The milk post workers and restaurant workers, the whole food chain, workers and that are like helping our existence, right? That's what we're still alive and in this crisis. And so, I think, and domestic workers, because although we told our members, domestic workers should stay home, thousands of them keep going to work. And many of them are falling sick, and some of them have died. So that's the reality, and that's what is important to have these conversations. And I will invite definitely, employers who are in this call to join hand in hand, to invite even allies, people who have a care connection, who have maybe had a nanny growing up, who has a house cleaner, who maybe have a parent who has, a home care worker. Everyone has a care story. Right, and that's what the people who really appreciate and value domestic work to be part of hand in hand and part of this movement.
Thank you. And Adam, how about with you guys? The hand in hand, you can, people can join. It's a 501c3. It's a little easier to figure out how you show up as an ally. What's it look like to show up as an ally to retail workers?
And also, Adam, there's a question that came in very quickly, which is just how does the union handling questions of pay or benefits for workers who are furloughed, to the extent that RWSDU covers some of those workers? Anyway, if you have time.
Yeah, so to answer that question, workers that were furloughed, we negotiated the terms of how much pay they would get before their furlough would officially start. And then we would walk workers through unemployment ourselves. So we have staff that would help workers do that. It's actually pretty important. A lot of people have trouble navigating the unemployment insurance. And we have a couple little tricks that we try to do with folks to get them in. And I think for furloughed workers, like right now, just an example, if I think Guitar Center, for example, that we represent in Union Square, the workers are insured still, through the end of June. So you have these examples of the union extending the health insurance fund, even if the employer is not going to pay it. Right. And so there's different things that furloughed workers, at the very least, there are a lot of non-union workers that we hear, they're not even getting responses from their employer right now if they're furloughed. Nobody's responding to them. They don't know if their job's back. I'm sure it's different per employer, but we're hearing a lot of that. So we're a conduit, that helps to at least get information to workers that can't get answers from their management too. As far as what you can do, encourage anyone in your family, anyone in your community to reach out to a union to organize. I think it's really important to recognize that no one gives anyone anything, especially at work. And the only way to achieve real change is to get together collectively. And it can actually happen. We've seen many employers meet the demands for PPE because workers organized, in which they may not have done so. They may not have done it as soon if workers didn't come together. So I would highly encourage that. And if, I can put my contact info down for anyone that might have any questions about know your rights at work. It's better to know your rights and talk with someone on how to best organize with your coworkers than to just try it on your own, because, employers will take advantage if they think you're not working with someone.
Great. And I just want to thank all of you, but Rachel, I want to thank you because it's unusual to find an organized group of users who are supporting benefits for workers. So it's very exciting.
I'm honored to do it.
Good. Brad, any final words? Tell us what Elizabeth Warren would have told us.
Yeah, well, she would say, please tweet with the hashtag Stand with Essential Workers. And because you were on this call, you can have in your mind that you're including domestic workers in essential workers, because they are. And I just put in the chat the link for the Essential Workers Bill of Rights petition for the New York City Council legislation. We had our hearing on Tuesday, but it'll be great to have people reach out to their council members and push them to become co-sponsors so we can move the bill forward. I think at the city and state levels both, there's a lot more that we can do. We need to win back the federal government. I mean, fundamentally, labor law, we got better won, stronger at the federal level. And I guess I'll say, like, if we're successful in getting rid of Donald Trump and winning back the Senate, one thing that has now happened in the last 2 Democratic presidential administrations was that labor law reform to make it easier to organize and broaden the set of people that could do it was pushed down the list. Should have been a top item, actually, both from a practical, pragmatic point of view, as well as doing the right thing. Like, it not only makes easier for workers to organize and have, decent lives and working conditions, but also, they're more likely to could be Democrats after they organized into a union. So it's stupid of the Democrats to have left labor and immigrants out, both of the last 2 times we were in power. Let's not let that happen again. So organize to win back the federal government and make sure we do labor law reform there. But there's a lot of things we can do at the city and state level in the meantime.
You're here. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Thank you everybody who called in. You'll get the follow-up that will give you everything that got posted in the chat and answers to any of your other questions. We're eager. Program is called Justice in Action. So we're eager to see you all following up and taking action to support the work that Adam and Rachel and Tatiana are doing. Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
Huge thanks to you guys for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.